There is a place sitting in the middle of Florida that has quietly confused engineers, architects, and construction professionals for decades. Not because it is ancient, not because it was built by a lost civilization, but because it was built by one man, a real man, a man who lived in the 20th century, paid taxes, had neighbors, and gave interviews to journalists. A man who stood 5 feet tall and weighed barely 100 pounds, and who moved more than 1,100 tons of coral rock, alone, without a single piece of heavy machinery that anyone ever identified. The largest stone in the structure weighs 30 tons, heavier than the stones used at Stonehenge, and he moved it, positioned it, placed it with a precision that trained construction crews have stood in front of and struggled to explain. Nobody watched him do it. Not once. In 28 years of construction, not a single person ever witnessed Edward Leedskalnin move a stone. And when people asked him how, he smiled and said he understood the secrets of the ancient Egyptians. That is where most people stop taking the story seriously. That is exactly where this story gets interesting. Edward Leedskalnin was born in 1887 in Latvia, in a rural region where stone was not just a building material, it was a way of life. His father was a stonemason. Edward grew up learning how rock behaves from the time he was old enough to hold a chisel, how it splits along natural lines, how it holds weight, how it responds differently depending on where and how force is applied. This was not a man who wandered into stonework by accident. He understood it from childhood. But his story did not begin with stone. It began with heartbreak. Her name was Agnes Scuffs. She was 10 years younger than Edward. He called her his sweet 16. By 1913 they were engaged, the wedding was planned, the future was decided. The night before the ceremony, Agnes called it off. Nobody recorded exactly what passed between them. What the historical record shows is that Edward left Latvia almost immediately. He crossed into Canada. He moved south through the United States. He contracted tuberculosis and spent months recovering while working whatever labor jobs he could find. He moved from town to town, carrying almost nothing. In 1923, he arrived in Florida, 36 years old, alone, starting from nothing. He bought a small piece of land near Florida City, south of Miami. And then, without telling anyone what he was planning, without hiring a single worker, without purchasing a single piece of machinery, he started cutting stone out of the ground. He would not stop for 28 years. Think about that for a moment. 28 years, alone, in the Florida heat, cutting and moving stones that should have required a team of men and heavy equipment. People drove past that land every single day. Nobody ever saw how he did it. Drop where you are watching this from in the comments right now and tell us what time it is there, because people from all over the world have stood in front of Coral Castle with the same look on their face. And every single one of them left with the same question. In 1936, Edward made a decision that took everything already strange about his story and made it impossible to ignore. He decided to move. Not just himself, everything he had built. A housing development was being planned near his land in Florida City. Edward did not want neighbors. He purchased 10 acres of land 25 miles north near the town of Homestead, and then he told the few people who knew him that he would be relocating his entire structure. More than 100 tons of already carved coral stone, 25 miles down a Florida highway, alone. Most people who heard this assumed he was joking. He was not. He hired a local truck driver named Roscoe Gibson to provide a flatbed trailer for the job. Gibson was not a close friend. He was simply a working man Edward had found who had the right equipment. Gibson later gave accounts of what he experienced during those months, and what he described is one of the most compelling first-hand pieces of this entire story. Edward gave Gibson simple instructions: arrive in the evening, drop the trailer at the property, leave, come back the following morning. So Gibson did exactly that. And every single morning when he returned, the trailer was loaded. Multi-ton stones sitting on the flatbed, secured, positioned, ready for transport, no equipment left behind, no mess, no evidence of the process that had just taken place overnight. Gibson made that trip repeatedly over several months. The pattern never once changed. He eventually asked Edward directly how he was doing it. Edward looked at him and said, "I understand the laws of weight and leverage better than others." Nothing more. Gibson had no reason to argue. He had watched the results dozens of times. He simply drove the stones north and kept his questions to himself. At Homestead, Edward rebuilt everything from the ground up. And what he constructed, there went far beyond what most people imagine when they hear the word castle. He built a 2-story tower where he lived, walls of solid coral rock standing 8 feet tall and 4 feet thick surrounding the entire compound, a working sundial accurate to within 2 minutes, a telescope aligned precisely to the North Star, a stone table carved in the shape of the state of Florida. And then there was the gate. A 9-ton coral gate set into the entrance wall of the compound, one continuous piece of stone, and it was balanced so perfectly on a single steel shaft that a small child, could push it open with one finger. Visitors did exactly that for decades. They pressed one finger against a 9-ton stone door and watched it swing smoothly open. Engineers who examined the gate shook their heads. The balance was not approximate, it was exact. The kind of precision that suggests either sophisticated measuring equipment or an intuitive understanding of weight distribution that most people spend entire careers never developing. Then in 1986, the gate stopped working. The bearing at the base had finally worn out after years of use. A professional crew was brought in to restore it, 5 engineers, a 50-ton crane. They removed the gate. They studied how Edward had originally set it. They had every advantage Edward never had: modern equipment, engineering degrees, full access to the structure. They could not rebalance it. The gate has never moved the same way since. 5 engineers with a 50-ton crane could not restore what one man weighing 100 pounds had achieved alone in the dark. That is not a legend. That is not an exaggerated story passed down until nobody remembers what actually happened. That is documented. It happened in 1986. People were there. It was recorded. And it raises a question that every explanation offered so far has failed to fully answer. How did he do it? When Edward died in December 1951, investigators went through his property, expecting to find the answer. Everyone assumed it was there somewhere, hidden in the tower, tucked behind a wall, some piece of equipment, some mechanical system, some device that explained how one small man had moved 30-ton stones across Florida without anyone seeing how. What they found were hand tools. A few chisels, some hammers, chains of various lengths, wooden tripods he had constructed himself from simple poles lashed together at the top. That was everything. No hydraulics, no hidden motors, no elaborate mechanical system, nothing that came within a reasonable distance of explaining what the stones in front of them required. One thing that struck every person who walked through that property after Edward's death was not what they found. It was the gap between what they found and what they were looking at. The tools that existed and the work that had been completed did not belong in the same story. But here is where the first real clue appears, and it comes not from investigators or engineers, it comes from Edward himself. Those wooden tripods were not random. 3 poles lashed together at the top, a chain hanging down from the center point, simple to look at, almost primitive. But when you understand what a correctly built and correctly used tripod system can accomplish, something shifts. A tripod used with genuine understanding of balance points allows a single person to tilt, rotate, and reposition extremely heavy objects with far less force than seems physically possible. The mathematics support it. The physics are real. But the key, the thing Edward understood that most people do not, is that you do not need to lift the stone. You need to find the point where the stone's own weight works for you, instead of against you. Edward called this the dead center. He described it directly to at least one visitor during his lifetime. He said every large stone has a dead center, a point of perfect balance where the mass becomes, in his own words, nothing. He said most people fail because they assume that heavy objects require heavy force. They push before they understand what they are pushing. Edward always understood the stone before he touched it. He would observe, calculate, study the weight distribution from every angle, sometimes for long periods before making a single move. Only when he was completely certain of what would happen did he apply any force at all. That description, finding the dead center before applying force, is not mysticism. It is a precise explanation of what engineers call the center of mass, the point in any object where the total weight is effectively concentrated. Apply force correctly at or through that point, and the object responds with the minimum possible resistance. Edward had no university degree, no formal physics training, no engineering credentials of any kind. He had discovered this through decades of solitary practice, through repetition, through failure in private and adjustment in private and eventual success in private. And the tripods made it possible to act on that understanding with stones that would have crushed him instantly if he miscalculated. So the tripods explain some of it. The dead center explains the balance. But stack those two things together, and there is still a problem that neither one fully resolves. Because the stones at Coral Castle did not start on the surface. They started underground. Edward did not build on top of the earth. He cut into it. And getting a 30-ton stone out of the ground, without anything tall enough to lift from above, required something beyond the tripods and beyond the dead center. It required Edward to use something that nobody who studied Coral Castle thought to look for until long after he was gone. Edward quarried his stones from below ground level. He did not find coral rock sitting on the surface and cut it into shape. He dug down into the earth, identified the stone he wanted, and cut it free from below. The quarry sites, the places where he extracted the raw material, sat several feet underground. That single fact changes everything about the construction question. Moving a 30-ton stone horizontally across flat ground is one problem, a solvable problem as the tripod system suggests. But lifting a 30-ton stone vertically out of a hole in the ground is a completely different problem. It requires either an enormous lifting force applied from directly above, a crane, a tower, something tall enough to provide that mechanical advantage, or a method of rotating the stone upward, incrementally using the surrounding earth itself as part of the system. Edward had no crane. He had no tower tall enough. He had nothing overhead that could have provided the force required to lift straight up, which means he did not lift the stones out of the ground. He walked them out, tilting each stone incrementally, using the walls of the quarry as bracing points, rotating the mass upward in controlled stages, moving the balance point with each shift until the stone reached the surface. Think carefully about what that process requires. Every move must be calculated before it happens. Every shift in weight must be anticipated and controlled. The margin for error at any point in that rotation is almost zero. If the balance shifts wrong, if the stone goes in the wrong direction at any stage of that process, there is no stopping it. A 30-ton stone moving in the wrong direction crushes everything in its path. Edward worked alone. There was no second person to correct a mistake, no crew to stabilize a shift, no one to pull him clear if something went wrong. In 28 years of moving stones that could have killed him instantly, Edward Leedskalnin never had a single recorded accident. Not one. That fact alone separates Edward from every theoretical explanation offered about Coral Castle. Because theories can explain possibility, they can show that the physics work, that the math supports it, that a tripod system combined with quarry wall leverage could, in principle, allow one person to extract and move stones of this size. But possibility and execution are two entirely different things. The gap between knowing something is theoretically possible and actually doing it, alone, at night, without a single mistake across nearly 3 decades, is a gap that physics equations cannot fully cross. Something else was operating in Edward Leedskalnin. And the people who knew him, who visited regularly, who spent real time in his company, all described the same quality when they tried to put it into words. Stillness. Not the stillness of a man who was slow or uncertain. The stillness of a man who was completely certain, who had already solved the problem in his mind before his hands ever touched the stone, who moved through his work the way a chess master moves through a game, never reacting, always executing a plan that existed long before the first piece moved. One visitor who spent an afternoon with Edward in the 1940s later wrote that he seemed to treat the stones the way a surgeon treats a patient. Total focus, total control, nothing rushed, nothing left to chance. That description matters more than it might first appear, because it tells us that Edward's real advantage was not just a technique. It was a discipline that most people never develop, because most people never commit to understanding one thing so completely, for so long, in such total solitude. But here is where this story opens into something larger. Because while Edward was building Coral Castle in Florida, while he was quietly solving construction problems that would later baffle engineers, he was also writing. Small pamphlets, self-published, sold to visitors for 25 cents each. And inside those pamphlets, Edward left something behind that researchers and engineers have argued about ever since. Not a confession, not a blueprint. Something stranger than either of those things. A direct claim about what he believed he had discovered, and why he believed the rest of the world had lost it. Drop this video a comment right now. We want to know, did you already know about Coral Castle before today, or is this the first time you are hearing this story? Because the next part of what Edward wrote changes how you see everything he built. Edward Leedskalnin believed the modern world had forgotten something. Not misplaced it, not failed to discover it, forgotten it, lost a working knowledge that had once existed and been used and then quietly disappeared from human understanding over centuries. He wrote about this directly in his pamphlets, small self-published booklets he sold at the gate for 25 cents. He was not writing for academics. He was not writing to impress anyone. He wrote the way a man writes when he is trying to record something important before it disappears again. He wrote about magnetism, specifically about what he called individual north and south magnetic currents, flows of magnetic force that he believed moved through all matter, including stone, including the human body, including the earth itself. He believed these currents could be understood, directed, and used. He believed that understanding them was the key to moving extremely heavy objects with minimal force. Mainstream physics does not recognize his theory in the form he described it. But here is what matters historically. Edward was not guessing. He was not writing fiction. He had built more than 1,000 tons of precisely placed coral rock before he wrote a single word of those pamphlets. Whatever he was describing, he had already demonstrated it. The stones were the proof. He never felt he needed to explain further. And when you read his descriptions carefully, not through the lens of mysticism, but through the lens of a self-taught man trying to describe something real in the only language available to him, something interesting emerges. He was describing electromagnetic principles. Imperfectly, without formal vocabulary, without the scientific framework that would have allowed him to express it in terms a physicist would recognize. But the underlying observation, That magnetic force interacts with mass in ways that can reduce effective weight during movement, is not entirely without basis in physics. It is simply not proven, not tested, not verified. And Edward never claimed it was. He claimed he had discovered it through practice, through repetition, through decades of working alone with stones that required him to find solutions that did not exist in any textbook. There is one specific structure at Coral Castle that brings everything Edward wrote into sharpest focus. The obelisk. Standing in the courtyard is a single piece of coral rock, 28 tons, 25 feet tall. One continuous piece of stone, not assembled from sections, not built up in layers, a single column quarried from below ground and raised to perfect vertical. Think about what raising that requires. To bring something that heavy to full vertical, you need either enormous force, applied from directly above, or a system that rotates the stone upward from the side, using ground-level leverage alone. Edward had no crane, nothing overhead, tall enough to apply force from above. He rotated it up from the ground. And the margin for error during that process is as close to zero as any construction challenge can get. At any degree between flat on the earth and fully vertical, if the balance shifts wrong, the stone falls. There is no recovering from that. There is no second attempt. Edward raised that obelisk to perfect vertical, without a recorded mistake, without a single documented injury, across the entire 28 years of construction. Engineers who have studied the obelisk specifically, who have sat down with the measurements and the weight and the geometry of what raising it required, all arrive at the same conclusion. The physics are possible. The execution is extraordinary. And then they arrive at the question that the physics cannot answer. How did a man with hand tools and wooden tripods develop the precision required to execute something like this without a single mistake? The tools explain the method in theory. They do not explain the man. And here is what the popular version of the Coral Castle story almost always leaves out. Edward did not stumble into this precision through natural talent. He built toward it. There is a detail about Edward's early life that rarely appears in any account of Coral Castle. Before he left Latvia, before Agnes, before Florida, Edward worked briefly at a quarry operation in his home region. Not as a stone cutter, as an assistant to the quarry engineer. He had seen professional quarrying methods. He had watched someone who understood stone at a technical level work through real construction problems. He had absorbed something during that time, however briefly, that he carried with him across an ocean and into a Florida field where nobody was watching. Whatever he learned in that quarry became the foundation. 28 years of solitary practice became the structure built on top of it. And the result is standing in Homestead, Florida right now. Waiting for an explanation that has not fully arrived, there is one question that gets asked more than any other about Coral Castle. If Edward really had discovered something, a genuine method, a real working understanding of how to move enormous stone with minimal force, why did nobody ever see him use it? It is a fair question. And the answer is simpler than most people expect. They tried. Multiple visitors during Edward's lifetime made deliberate attempts to watch him work. Not casually glancing over a fence, deliberate attempts, arriving unannounced at unusual hours, positioning themselves where they believed they could observe without being noticed. Edward always knew they were there. Every single account from visitors who attempted to watch him work describes the same result. They would find a position, they would wait, and then Edward would simply stop. He would sit quietly, he would do nothing, he would wait longer than they were willing to wait. And eventually, they would leave. Edward never confronted anyone, never asked anyone to go. He simply outlasted them every time. One visitor from the 1940s wrote about spending the better part of an afternoon attempting to observe Edward from a distance. Edward sat in his courtyard the entire time, doing nothing in particular. When the visitor finally gave up and approached to speak with him directly, Edward was perfectly pleasant. He offered the visitor a tour. He answered questions about the structure. He said nothing about having noticed anyone watching. He never acknowledged it. But the moment the visitor had arrived, the work had stopped. Edward protected his method the way most people protect nothing, with total patience, with zero confrontation, with an absolute certainty that time was on his side. But he did not protect everything. The pamphlets existed, the conversations existed, and there were moments, specific moments with specific visitors, where Edward said things that were more direct than his usual careful answers. One of those moments involved a young man who visited Coral Castle in the late 1930s and asked Edward a direct question about the gate. Not how it was built, how it was balanced. Edward did not deflect, he answered. He told the young man that the secret of the gate was not in the gate itself. It was in what he called finding the living center of the stone. He said every large stone has a point where the weight becomes cooperative, where the mass stops working against you and starts working with you. He said most people never find that point because they approach stone as an obstacle. They try to overpower it. Edward said he never tried to overpower anything. He said he simply found the point where the stone was willing to move. That answer sounds almost poetic. But strip away the language, and what Edward described is mechanically precise. The living center, the dead center, the point of perfect balance where applied force meets minimum resistance. He described it differently to different people over the years, but the core of every description was identical. Find the point, apply force at that point, the stone moves. The question that nobody has answered is not whether that principle is real. It is real, it is basic physics, it is the center of mass. The question is how Edward located that point with sufficient precision on stones weighing 10, 20, 30 tons, alone, at night, without measuring equipment, and then applied force to it with enough control to move those stones without a single recorded mistake across 28 years. That is the gap. Not between magic and reality, between theory and execution. And it is a gap that every person who has studied Coral Castle seriously has eventually arrived at and been unable to cross. There is one more thing, Edward said, that has stayed with researchers longer than almost anything else he ever offered. A journalist visited Coral Castle in the 1940s and asked Edward what he would do if someone offered him modern construction equipment. Cranes, machinery, a full crew of workers. Edward thought about the question for a moment. Then he said he would not use any of it. Not because he was stubborn, not because he distrusted modern technology. He said he would not use it because it would make the work harder. He said machinery forces you to work against the stone. His method worked with it. That answer has never been fully explained. And it becomes even harder to dismiss when you stand in front of what he built and understand that a 50-ton crane and 5 professional engineers could not restore the balance of a gate that Edward set alone with wooden tripods and chains. The machinery made their work harder. Edward Leedskalnin died on December 7, 1951. He was found in his tower having suffered a stroke. A neighbor discovered him and called for help. He was taken to Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami. He died 3 days later without regaining full consciousness. He was 64 years old. He had 10 cents in his pocket. That detail was recorded by the hospital at the time of admission. 10 cents. Everything he carried on him after 28 years of building something that drew visitors from across the country, after selling pamphlets at the gate, after charging admission to walk through what he had built. 10 cents. He was not building toward money. He was not building toward recognition. He was not building toward a legacy that the world would spend decades arguing about. He was building toward something only he fully understood. And when he was gone, that understanding went with him. The property sat uncertain for a period after his death. Edward had a nephew back in Latvia, his only surviving close relative. The nephew had never visited Florida, had never seen Coral Castle, had no connection to the 28 years of solitary work that had produced it. He sold it. The property eventually became a tourist attraction. The stones became a roadside curiosity along South Dixie Highway. The man who moved them became a caption on a brochure, the heartbroken Latvian immigrant who built a castle for the girl who left him. That version of the story is not entirely wrong. Agnes Scuffs was real. The heartbreak was real. The long solitary years in Florida were real. And there is something genuinely human about a man who channeled the worst moment of his life into 28 years of extraordinary work. But that version of the story is dangerously incomplete, because it reduces Edward Leedskalnin to a romantic footnote when the historical reality is something far more remarkable. Edward was a self-taught man who developed a working understanding of weight, balance, and leverage that allowed him to accomplish something that trained engineers with modern equipment have genuinely failed to replicate. Not struggled to replicate, failed. The gate they could not rebalance, the obelisk standing at perfect vertical without a single recorded mistake during its installation, the tools found after his death that should not have been sufficient, the 28 years of construction without a single documented accident. None of that came from heartbreak. It came from something rarer and harder to explain than a broken heart. It came from a level of understanding so deep and so completely self-developed that it left no trail anyone has been able to follow. Edward worked alone because he thought alone. He solved problems alone. He tested and failed and adjusted alone. In the dark, in the Florida heat, without an audience and without any apparent need for one. He was not performing a mystery. He was doing work. And the mystery is simply what that work looks like to everyone who was not inside his mind while he was doing it. Coral Castle is still standing. You can visit it today. It sits on South Dixie Highway in Homestead, Florida, exactly where Edward rebuilt it after moving it 25 miles in the middle of the night. The obelisk has not moved. The walls are the same walls. The courtyard Edward shaped alone in the dark is open to anyone who wants to walk through it. And the experience of standing inside it is different from reading about it. Reading about it, you can maintain a comfortable distance. You can file it under unexplained and move on. Standing inside it, with the weight of those stones visible from every direction, with the precision of those cuts apparent to anyone who looks closely, that comfortable distance becomes harder to maintain. Because the stones are not mysterious in the way that word usually gets used. They are not strange looking. They are not covered in symbols. They do not glow or hum or suggest anything supernatural. They are simply too good. Too precise, too heavy, too perfectly placed for the tools and the man and the method that produced them. And that specific kind of mystery, the kind that lives in the gap between what exists and what should have been possible, is the hardest kind to walk away from. Engineers have studied Coral Castle for decades. They have measured the stones, calculated the weights, examined the cuts, tested the theories, built scale models, run the mathematics. And the honest conclusion, the one that serious researchers arrive at when they set aside both the supernatural explanations and the desire to make the mystery disappear, is this. We understand more than we did. The tripods explain some of the movement. The dead center principle explains the gate. The quarry wall leverage explains the extraction. The brief professional experience in Latvia explains some of the foundational knowledge Edward carried with him. Put all of those pieces together, and you have a picture of a man who was more educated, more experienced, and more methodical than the popular story ever gave him credit for. But the pieces do not complete the picture. There is still a gap between what the tools could do and what the stones required, between the timeline of construction and what one person working alone should physically have been capable of, between the precision of the finished work and the simplicity of the equipment that produced it. That gap is real. It is not manufactured by people who want the mystery to be bigger than it is. It is the honest conclusion of people who wanted the mystery to be smaller and found that the evidence would not allow it. Edward Leedskalnin spent 28 years building something he never fully explained. He left behind pamphlets that described his theory in language that mixed genuine observation with ideas science cannot verify. He left behind conversations that offered pieces without ever completing the picture. He left behind the stones themselves, which are the most complete record he ever produced of what he knew. And he left behind one statement, recorded by multiple visitors who heard versions of it across different years, that remains the closest thing to a direct answer he ever gave. He said, "I have discovered the secrets used to build the pyramids. Not guess them, not theorize them. Discovered them. Through practice, through patience, through decades of solitary work that produced results the modern world has not been able to fully account for." Whether he was right about the Egyptians is a question history may never resolve. But the question his own work raises has a different quality entirely. Because the pyramids are ancient, their builders are gone. Their methods exist only in what they left behind and what we have been able to infer from it across thousands of years. Coral Castle is not ancient. It was built within living memory, by a man whose neighbors are on record, whose tools were catalogued, whose property was examined, whose words were written down. And still, we know what he built. We know where he built it. We know when he built it. We know the tools he used. We know what he said about how he did it. The only thing that remains, the one thing that every engineer and researcher and curious visitor has walked away from Coral Castle without, is how. Not approximately how, not theoretically how. Exactly how. And until that answer exists, Edward Leedskalnin will remain exactly what he was in life. A quiet man, working alone in the dark, moving stones that should not have moved, and leaving the world to figure out the rest.